Okay, so thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to present some of my PhD research. Childhood in the past is becoming more of a fixture in research, but the study of adolescence in the past is still quite an understudied area. So I just want to spend a few slides explaining what it is about and what we do when we talk about research on adolescence. So, as we all know, adolescence is the biological and social transitional period from childhood into adulthood. And it is studied by many disciplines, from clinical research, biological anthropology, the social sciences, for its plasticity and its sensitivity to the environmental conditions that we experience. And this is because it is so multifactorial, which I wanted to just show some of the factors that influence adolescence. And all these factors make it quite complex to interpret sometimes, but it also gives us ample opportunities to study living conditions in the past. And it's also particularly well suited for life history approaches because early life experience massively impacts adolescence and the timing of adolescence, and also the living conditions that we experience during this adolescent period has impacts for later life. Here you see growth curves of the life cycle, and it all starts with puberty. Puberty is technically only the first onset so that the first hormonal changes that kickstart adolescence, and this then releases the sex steroid hormones, testosterone, and the estrogens that then kickstart the pubertal growth spurt and the development of the different secondary sex characteristics that we all know. And we can divide the phase of adolescence in several subphases in relation to the growth velocity. And you can kind of see this here. I don't know if, no, you won't see this here, but growth after puberty starts to accelerate pretty quickly, and until we reach a maximum growth velocity or maximum peak height velocity. And this is when we have some very clear changes that we see in adolescence. So usually this is when males get a croaky voice and females start to developing breasts and so on. And then growth decelerates again. This is usually when the first menstrual bleeding happens. It's also called menarche. And then it keeps on slowing down until we reach our final adult height and physique. On the right side, you can see that it is important to observe adolescence in the sexes separately because females are around 2 years ahead of males in the growth spurt. The timing of puberty and different milestones have been recognized as they have been observed for the last 180 years in Europe, and here we can see that the onset of these has been steadily declining, and we think this is mostly due to a betterment in nutrition and the absence of major infectious diseases in the more recent history in Europe. But what does this look like in the past? To study this, Mary Lewis and colleagues have adapted some clinical methods that usually work with radiographs, and they have adapted this to be accessible on dry bone. So there's several indicators, and there's new ones that are being introduced, but the classical ones that we use are in the dentition, the cervical spine, in the wrists, the hands and the elbows, and the pelvis. And if we have enough of these indicators, we can kind of assess where along the growth spurt an individual is. And we also try to always estimate sex in non-adults, which is obviously challenging because actually the sex dimorphism doesn't really develop until later adolescence. And there are also some indicators that give us an approximation for when menarche happens. So far, adolescence or the pubertal timing has been studied in relation to some chronic disease indicators. For example, Mary Lewis found that severe chronic diseases such as tuberculosis, treponema diseases, and leprosy can delay pubertal timing. And they also found, together with Sharon DeWitt, she looked at the health shifts after the Black Death, and they found that with a betterment of health after the Black Death, also the age of menarche likely happened earlier again. Researchers are also starting to use isotopes to study this period. They look at mobility, and they also look at the impact of nutrition. And a very recent study from Spain has also looked at the social treatment of adolescents, and they found that the changing physique of adolescents was correlated with a change in burial location. So as you can see on this map, we're getting more studies, but it is at this point very focused on Western Europe and Southern Europe, and there is no population studies at this point from Central and Eastern Europe. And we also have a large 500-year research gap of where we don't know how the pubertal timing what pubertal timing looks like. The larger studies are from the Roman period in France, Italy, and the UK, and from the later medieval period in England. So, as you've heard many times today, the Histogenes project, which studies the early medieval period in the Carpathian Basin, I think is well equipped to address some of these research gaps. As you heard, within this project we have some comprehensive ADNA sampling of of complete sites, and I picked two of those on the western edge of the Awa Empire and from the late Ava period, and I looked at 147 individuals from the two sites called Leobersdorf and Mödling. They're close to today's Vienna. And 89 of those individuals were preserved well enough for me to assess puberty. As I said, yeah, I have the genetic sex, and these are more rural sites in comparison to the more urban sites that we have from the Roman period and the High Medieval period, and I compared them to the only published raw data that we have so far from Italy and France from the Roman period. So, what did I find? It seems that puberty started around the age of 10. From there, we see some physical changes, and then growth maximum was probably reached around the age of 15. And this is when we can see some clear signs of puberty or adolescence, and then growth probably was completed around the age of 20. But brain development probably still continued until the early 20s. I did find some sex difference. As I said earlier, females usually develop earlier, and that's also what I found, around 1.8 years. They develop 1.8 years earlier, so that gives me a little confidence that this is maybe some real patterns that we are observing. I also tried to reconstruct the age at menarche because it is an important, maybe also exterior signal for the community, because it's a maturity indicator, and it also has a lot of clinical research that we can fall back on. And I found that this probably happened around the age of 15, or more broadly, probably between 13 and 17 years in this population. And from this, I estimated that the reproductive age might have started somewhere between 17 and 22 years. This is because females usually go through a 2 to 5 year period where the basically they're females are not as fertile yet, so it's the so-called adolescent subfecundity. This is the body still prepares for reproduction later on because the body is still growing. Yeah. And this actually aligns rather well with some genetic data we have from the center of the Ewa Empire. These are contemporaneous sites that we already actually heard about today. And from there, they estimated that the reproductive age probably started around 18 to 20 years. Yeah. Sandra Rabnitz, a historian in the project, also looked at some historical sources to contextualize the adolescence phase for this context. And while there are no direct sources from the Avars themselves, there are descriptions on other Eurasian steppe people that maybe apply to our context. For example, there's the Orkhon inscriptions in today's Mongolia from the same time period, and they talk about a prince who received his adult name with the age of 10. That coincidentally is also the age when I think puberty started in our population, but I think more broadly this just tells us that people recognize the change during this phase in their youth. And there are also some Chinese descriptions on the Xiongnu people, another Asian steppe people that the Avars are related to. And here the Chinese historiographers say the little boys start out by learning to ride sheep and shoot birds and rats with a bow and arrow. And when they get a little older, they shoot foxes and hares, which are used for food. Thus, all the young men are able to use a bow and act as armed cavalry in times of war. And that's not just an adorable mental image, I think, but also tells us something about maybe the progressive acquiring of skills in this community. Yeah. The material evidence gives us some preliminary info that the social treatment probably changed also during the adolescence phase. Particularly, we see a increase in burial goods, we have more of these elaborate belt sets that are important in the Ava context that you see over here, and females also had more belt buckles. So we think that probably the attire and the clothing changed during this time period. And this is also this middle adolescence phase when we can see some clear evidence of transition. Yeah, but we need to do more fine-grained research to confirm this. I also looked at some paleopathological indicators to see if I can tease out some changes here. And I found that trauma mostly occurs towards the end of the growth spurt in later adolescence, from the deceleration stage onwards. And we don't have any evidence for interpersonal violence here. So potentially these are some accidental traumas. And we do see some beginning joint disease also towards the end of this growth spurt. And I found that Schmol's nodes and osteochondritis dissecans, those are degenerative defects on the joint surfaces of the extremities and the spine, start to pop up around this growth maximum. And I want to say that, for example, these defects are just generally associated with adolescence because the joints are just more susceptible to these defects. But clinically, they are also linked to strenuous repetitive activities. For example, there are common occurrence in young athletes today. So potentially, we do see some indicators that these young people already contributed to the societies with physical tasks. I also found some sex differences in the pathologies. I found that young females had more respiratory disease. Again, one could think about maybe there is some kind of gendered labor division, but it could also just mean that they had worse living conditions. And I also want to say that I think if we heard in the morning, the young females were really the most mobile group. Potentially they're just more exposed to pathogens as well. Yeah, for some of these sex-specific puberty stages, we had quite some large age ranges, up to 5 to 8 years sometimes. So this suggests to me that individuals went into puberty at different times, or maybe that the tempo of development differed between the individuals. And I could also see that those individuals that developed later had more of these non-specific stress indicators like cribrorbitalia and enamel hypoplasia. And I think this would make sense because potentially they had to divert some of the energy more into survival rather than development and growth. As I said, I also compared the early medieval period to the existing data that we have from the Roman period so far and the later medieval period. And I found that in pretty much all of the different phases, the early medieval individuals seem to develop a little later. But I also want to say that my sample size was quite smaller than, for example, the late medieval individuals. And we all used some different age estimation methods, so there might be quite some bias going on here. What could this mean? It's quite complex, as I wanted to show with my first slide, but I still want to try to make some interpretations. The large-scale paleopathological study of backbone in Europe compared, I think they looked at 15,000 skeletons from all over Europe, and one of their conclusions was that the early medieval period was supposedly a rather favorable period to live in, like compared at least to the previous Roman period and the later medieval period, where we have more maybe population density, and that might have been a negative impact on health. Based on this, I actually expected the early medieval individuals to develop a little earlier, but that's not what the data shows at this point. It could. One of the ways that how these individuals differ is definitely also genetics. As you heard earlier as well, the Avars have varying degrees of Asian ancestry, and 50 to 80% of pubertal timing is actually probably due to genetic factors. So this could be an explanation. And the Roman individuals that I compared the early medieval period individuals to are mostly of middle socioeconomic status, so potentially they're a little more well-off than the Roman commoners. Maybe this would look differently if we had a larger data set. And I also wonder if the timing of stress could have an impact. Potentially, rural-urban environments were really unhealthy, and this could have already impacted the unborn children in utero. And we know that stress in utero leads to fetal programming that affects the individuals to develop later in life, because they anticipate a shorter lifespan. Right, so we need definitely more studies to make some better statements about diachronical change. This is just the data we have at this point, but we need some more local signals. And we also need to maybe work out how we can report pubertal timing in a more standardized way so it becomes more comparable. Right. Thank you very much for listening, and I want to also thank my team from the Natural History Museum in Vienna at the University of Vienna, and also the larger Histogenes team that supported me. Thank you very much.